In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like cosmic tides, there exists a universal truth that transcends species, planets, and star systems: loyalty knows no boundaries. What happens when that loyalty is tested not by death, but by abandonment? When the very beings you've served without question leave you behind in the chaos of war? This is the story of Kethvar, a genetically enhanced war companion from the militant Zephyrian Empire, whose world collapsed in a single, devastating moment. Left to die on a battlefield littered with the remnants of a 1,000-year conflict, this alien creature's fate seemed sealed until an unlikely species arrived. Humans, barely recognized in the galactic community, would prove that compassion isn't just a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that can reshape the very fabric of the universe. Prepare to witness how a single act of kindness can ignite a revolution that spans star systems, and how the bond between species can become the most powerful weapon in the galaxy. The crimson sands of Zirion Prime stretched endlessly beneath 3 dying suns, each casting its own shadow across the battlefield that had claimed millions of lives over the past 72 standard hours. The air hung thick with the metallic taste of spilled blood and the acrid smoke of destroyed war machines, creating a hellscape that would haunt survivors for generations to come. Kethvar lay motionless beside the twisted wreckage of a Zephyrian assault mech, his powerful limbs pinned beneath a beam of collapsed superalloy. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each exhale creating small clouds of vapor in the cooling atmosphere as the planet's triple suns began their synchronized descent toward the horizon. The creature's 6 legs, each as thick as a human torso and covered in chitinous plates that gleamed like black diamonds, twitched involuntarily as pain coursed through his massive frame. Standing nearly 4 meters tall at his shoulder when healthy, Kethvar represented the pinnacle of Zephyrian biological engineering. His species, the Vorthak, had been selectively bred and genetically modified over countless generations to serve as the perfect war companions for the Empire's elite forces. Their natural pack intelligence had been enhanced to near-sapient levels, their already formidable physical capabilities pushed beyond normal biological limits, and their loyalty programmed so deeply into their genetic code that betrayal was literally impossible. The beast's 4 eyes, arranged in pairs on opposite sides of his elongated skull, flickered between consciousness and the growing darkness that threatened to claim him. Each eye was the size of a human fist, with pupils that could dilate to capture even the faintest traces of light. Bioluminescent veins pulsed weakly beneath his midnight black hide, casting eerie blue patterns across his form as his enhanced circulatory system struggled to maintain basic functions. His handler, Squadron Commander Veltar of the 9th Zephyrian Assault Division, lay 15 meters away. The proud warrior's body had been torn nearly in half by a plasma cannon blast, his elaborate ceremonial armor now nothing more than scorched metal fragments scattered across the red sand. Even in death, the commander's 3-fingered hand still clutched the neural control rod that had been used to direct Kethvar's actions in battle. For 18 standard years, Kethvar had served at Veltar's side, their minds linked through advanced biotechnology that allowed for near-instantaneous communication and coordination. They had conquered 14 worlds together, crushed 7 major rebellions, and earned commendations from the Emperor himself. The bond between handler and war beast was considered sacred in Zephyrian culture, transcending simple military cooperation to become something approaching spiritual unity. Now that bond was severed forever, leaving Kethvar with a hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. The neural implants that had once carried Veltar's commands now emitted only static, a constant reminder of his isolation. Without a handler to provide direction and purpose, a Vorthak war beast was expected to die honorably, preferably in service to the Empire. But honor seemed meaningless when the Empire itself had abandoned him. The evacuation had begun 3 hours after the final Terran Alliance bombardment had silenced the last Zephyrian defensive positions. Massive transport vessels had descended from orbit like mechanical vultures, their cargo bays swallowing entire battalions of surviving soldiers. Kethvar had watched from his trapped position as his fellow Vorthak were led aboard the ships alongside their handlers, their powerful forms dwarfing the humanoid Zephyrians who commanded them. He had called out, his voice producing the subsonic harmonics that served as the Vorthak's primary means of communication. The low-frequency rumble could travel for kilometers, capable of penetrating armor and reaching the sensitive auditory organs of his kind. Several of his packmates had turned in response, their own calls creating a brief chorus of recognition and solidarity. But their handlers had quickly activated neural dampening fields, forcing the beasts to ignore their wounded comrade and continue toward the evacuation ships. One young Vorthak named Thal had actually broken free from his handler's control, charging toward Kethvar's position with the obvious intention of attempting a rescue. The beast had made it less than 50 meters before a neural shock from his control rod had sent him crashing to the ground in convulsions. By the time Thal had recovered, the evacuation fleet was already lifting off, carrying the survivors of the 9th Assault Division toward distant stars and new campaigns. Kethvar had been left behind not out of malice, but out of cold military pragmatism. The beam pinning him weighed several tons and would have required heavy equipment to move. The evacuation was already behind schedule, with Terran Alliance reinforcements expected within hours. Commander Veltar was dead, making Kethvar officially ownerless property according to military regulations. The logical decision was to abandon the wounded beast and preserve resources for more strategically valuable assets. Logic, however, provided little comfort to a creature capable of complex emotional responses. Kethvar understood the tactical reasoning behind his abandonment, but understanding didn't ease the devastating sense of betrayal that gnawed at his consciousness. The empire he had served so faithfully had discarded him like a broken weapon, leaving him to die alone on an alien world. As darkness fell and the triple moons of Zirion Prime began to rise, painting the battlefield in silvery light, Kethvar's enhanced hearing detected the approach of scavenger drones. The small, spider-like machines moved through the wreckage with mechanical precision, harvesting valuable materials from destroyed equipment and bodies. Their plasma cutters cast brief, brilliant flashes across the landscape as they worked, reducing the remnants of a galactic conflict to raw materials and recyclable components. The Vorthak's predatory instincts, still functioning despite his injuries, catalogued the drones as potential threats. His claws, each as long as a human forearm and sharp enough to penetrate starship armor, scraped against the metal beam as he attempted to work himself free. The effort sent fresh waves of agony through his damaged nervous system, but desperation drove him beyond normal pain thresholds. He had nearly managed to shift the beam a few centimeters when the sound of approaching repulsors reached his acute hearing. The whine of anti-gravity engines was different from the mechanical skittering of the scavenger drones, suggesting the presence of a larger vessel. Kethvar's eyes swiveled toward the sound, his night vision automatically adjusting to penetrate the growing darkness. What he saw defied his expectations entirely. A small transport vessel, clearly not of Zephyrian origin, was descending toward the battlefield. Its design was unfamiliar, featuring smooth curves and flowing lines that stood in stark contrast to the angular, aggressive aesthetics favored by most galactic militaries. The craft's hull gleamed with an opalescent finish that seemed to shift colors in the moonlight, and its engine signature was remarkably quiet compared to standard military vessels. The ship touched down approximately 200 meters from Kethvar's position, its landing struts extending to accommodate the uneven terrain. A boarding ramp descended with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure, and figures began to emerge from the vessel's interior. Even with his enhanced vision, Kethvar had difficulty making out details at such a distance, but he could see that the newcomers were bipedal and roughly humanoid in shape. Their movement patterns were unlike anything in his extensive military database. Where Zephyrian soldiers moved with rigid discipline and mechanical precision, these beings displayed a fluid, almost organic grace. They advanced across the battlefield in small groups, pausing frequently to examine debris and bodies with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than the clinical detachment of military scavengers. One group approached a cluster of fallen Zephyrian troopers, and Kethvar watched in confusion as the strangers began performing what looked like medical examinations on the corpses. They moved with careful deliberation, treating even the dead with a reverence that was completely alien to the Vorthak's understanding of post-battle protocols. In Zephyrian culture, the fallen were stripped of useful equipment and left for scavenger drones to process. The idea of showing respect to enemy dead was not just foreign but potentially dangerous, as it wasted valuable time that could be spent on strategic objectives. As the unknown beings continued their methodical examination of the battlefield, one group began moving in Kethvar's general direction. The Vorthak remained motionless, uncertain whether these newcomers represented a threat or an opportunity. His combat protocols suggested defensive aggression, but his current condition made fighting impossible even if he had wanted to engage. The approaching group consisted of 4 individuals, each carrying equipment that Kethvar's military training couldn't immediately identify. Their clothing appeared to be some form of environmental suit, though the material looked far more flexible and comfortable than standard military gear. They moved with obvious caution but showed none of the predatory alertness that characterized soldiers in hostile territory. When they were still 50 meters away, the lead figure raised what might have been a scanning device, sweeping it across the area where Kethvar lay trapped. The Vorthak felt a strange tingling sensation as the scan passed over him, suggesting that the device was far more sophisticated than simple visual reconnaissance. His enhanced metabolism was probably generating a clear thermal signature, making concealment impossible. The leader of the group stopped suddenly, apparently reacting to readings from the scanning device. A brief exchange of communication occurred between the team members, their voices carrying across the still air in a language that bore no resemblance to any in Kethvar's linguistic database. The sounds were surprisingly melodic, with complex harmonic undertones that suggested sophisticated vocal capabilities. What happened next challenged everything Kethvar thought he understood about interspecies relations. Instead of approaching with weapons drawn or maintaining a safe distance, the team began moving directly toward his position with obvious urgency. Their posture suggested concern rather than hostility, and the leader had switched the scanning device to what appeared to be a medical configuration. As they drew closer, Kethvar could finally see the aliens clearly. They were indeed humanoid, but with several distinctive characteristics that set them apart from any species in his memory banks. Their skin had a pale, almost translucent quality, and their facial features were more delicate and symmetrical than typical military races. Most surprising of all were their eyes, which appeared to be capable of expressing complex emotions with remarkable clarity. The team leader, who seemed to be female based on subtle anatomical cues, approached to within 10 meters of Kethvar before stopping. She raised her hands in what was clearly meant to be a peaceful gesture, then began speaking in that same melodic language. While the words were incomprehensible, the tone conveyed something that the Vorthak had rarely encountered in his military career: genuine concern for his welfare. Kethvar's training told him to remain silent, to observe these potential enemies without revealing any information about his capabilities or condition. But something about the aliens' behavior triggered responses that ran deeper than military conditioning. The female's voice carried harmonics that resonated with frequencies his own species used to express care and protection, suggesting either remarkable coincidence or sophisticated knowledge of Vorthak psychology. Unable to resist the impulse, Kethvar released a low, subsonic call that indicated pain and distress. It was a sound he had never made in the presence of enemies, a vocalization that revealed vulnerability and appealed for aid. The response from the alien team was immediate and startling. All four beings moved closer, their body language shifting from caution to active concern, and the leader began manipulating her scanning device with obvious expertise. The female approached the massive beam pinning Kethvar, running her scanner along its length while making soft sounds that seemed intended to be soothing. She then turned to her companions and began what was clearly a technical discussion, their conversation punctuated by gestures toward both the trapped Vorthak and their transport vessel. One team member returned to the ship at a run, while the others began unpacking additional equipment from their gear packs. Kethvar watched in growing amazement as they assembled what appeared to be a sophisticated medical station right there on the battlefield, their movements efficient but unhurried. The return team member brought a large device that looked like it might be some form of anti-gravity lifting equipment. The female leader approached Kethvar again, this time moving slowly enough to avoid triggering his defensive reflexes. She held up a small device that projected what appeared to be a holographic interface, complete with symbols and diagrams that seemed designed to communicate across language barriers. The display showed a simplified representation of the Vorthak's current situation, followed by animated sequences depicting a rescue procedure. What struck Kethvar most profoundly was that the aliens were asking for his permission. The holographic interface included clear symbols for agreement and refusal, allowing him to choose whether to accept their assistance. In his entire military career, no one had ever asked a Vorthak war beast for consent regarding medical treatment. They were considered valuable property, to be maintained and repaired as circumstances permitted, but their opinions were irrelevant to operational decisions. The concept of choice was so foreign that Kethvar initially didn't understand what was being offered. He stared at the holographic display, his enhanced intelligence struggling to process the implications of what he was seeing. These unknown aliens were not only willing to help him but were treating him as a being capable of making informed decisions about his own fate. After several moments of internal conflict, Kethvar extended one massive claw to touch the agreement symbol on the holographic interface. The female's face immediately brightened with what could only be described as joy, and she began speaking rapidly to her companions. Their response was equally enthusiastic, and they immediately set about positioning their equipment around the trapped beam. What followed was the most sophisticated rescue operation Kethvar had ever witnessed. The aliens worked with a coordination that rivaled the finest military units, but their methodology was completely different from anything in his experience. Where soldiers would have used brute force and accepted collateral damage, these beings employed precision and care that bordered on the artistic. The anti-gravity device was positioned at multiple points along the beam, creating a complex field matrix that would distribute lifting forces evenly and minimize stress on Kethvar's trapped limbs. Medical sensors were placed around his body, monitoring vital signs and automatically adjusting the rescue parameters to prevent additional injury. Most remarkably, the team leader maintained constant communication with him throughout the process, using simple gestures and holographic displays to explain each step and confirm his comfort level. The actual extraction took nearly 2 hours, as the aliens refused to rush the procedure despite the obvious dangers of remaining on an active battlefield. They lifted the beam in microscopic increments, constantly monitoring Kethvar's condition and adjusting their approach based on his physiological responses. When they encountered complications, they paused to discuss alternatives rather than forcing a solution that might cause further harm. By the time Kethvar's limbs were finally free, the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the horizon. The Vorthak attempted to stand but immediately collapsed as damaged muscles and compressed joints failed to support his massive frame. The aliens had apparently anticipated this, because they already had a transport gurney ready, specifically designed to accommodate his unusual anatomy. Getting a 4-meter-tall, multi-ton creature onto a medical transport should have been impossible for 4 individuals equipped with portable equipment. But the aliens' technology proved equal to the challenge, using a combination of anti-gravity fields and mechanical leverage to position Kethvar safely on the gurney. Throughout the process, they maintained their careful attention to his comfort and dignity, treating him not as rescued salvage but as a patient deserving of respect. As they moved him toward their ship, Kethvar caught sight of the Zephyrian evacuation zone in the distance. The area was completely empty now, marked only by landing pad impressions in the sand and scattered debris. His people were gone, carrying on their war among distant stars, while he traveled toward an uncertain future with aliens whose very existence challenged his fundamental understanding of galactic civilization. The interior of the alien vessel was unlike any military transport he had ever seen. Where Zephyrian ships were designed for maximum efficiency and minimal comfort, this craft seemed built around the needs of living beings. The walls were covered with soft, organic-looking materials that seemed to pulse with gentle bioluminescence. The air carried unfamiliar but pleasant scents that somehow managed to be both alien and comforting. They positioned him in what was clearly a medical bay, equipped with scanning devices and treatment systems that appeared far more advanced than standard military field medicine. The female leader began a thorough examination, her instruments mapping every aspect of his physiology with gentle precision. For the first time since his capture and modification as a juvenile, Kethvar felt like he was being treated as a living being rather than a weapon. As the ship lifted off from Zirian Prime, carrying him away from the battlefield where his old life had ended, Kethvar experienced something completely new to his genetically programmed existence. For the first time in his life, he felt hope. The journey from Zirian Prime to wherever these mysterious aliens were taking him lasted 6 standard days, during which Kethvar experienced medical care unlike anything he had encountered in his 18 years of military service. The female who had led his rescue, whom he had begun to think of as the healer, visited him regularly in the ship's medical bay, monitoring his recovery with equipment that seemed to understand his physiology better than he understood it himself. On the second day, she had introduced herself using a series of gestures and holographic displays that gradually built up a basic vocabulary between them. Her name, as best as Kethvar could interpret it, was something like Sarah Chen, with harmonic undertones that his vocal cords couldn't reproduce. She was apparently a doctor and xenobiologist from a species called humans, a name that carried no recognition in any of his military databases. The revelation that his rescuers were completely unknown to the galactic community raised troubling questions about the scope of Zephyrian intelligence networks. How had an entire sapient species remained hidden from the Empire's vast surveillance apparatus? More importantly, what did their technological capabilities suggest about humanity's potential as either an ally or a threat? Dr. Chen's approach to his treatment revealed philosophical differences that challenged Kethvar's fundamental understanding of interspecies relations. Where Zephyrian military medicine focused on returning war assets to combat readiness as quickly as possible, human medical practice seemed to prioritize something called quality of life. The distinction became apparent when Dr. Chen spent hours adjusting his pain management protocols not to maximize his fighting capacity, but simply to make him more comfortable. The concept of comfort for its own sake was alien to Vortak military conditioning. Kethvar had been trained from birth to view pain as a tool for maintaining combat effectiveness, a reminder that survival required constant vigilance and peak performance. The idea that suffering could be reduced without compromising operational capability seemed almost heretical to his ingrained worldview. Yet as the days passed and his injuries healed under Dr. Chen's care, Kethvar began to experience something he had no words to describe. His enhanced healing factor, boosted by human medical technology, repaired damaged tissues faster than ever before. But, more significantly, the absence of chronic pain allowed him to think with a clarity he had never experienced. Without the constant stress of discomfort and the need to suppress natural responses, his consciousness seemed to expand in unexpected directions. Dr. Chen encouraged this mental development through a series of exercises that she described as cognitive rehabilitation. Using holographic interfaces and interactive programs, she tested his problem-solving abilities, memory capacity, and abstract reasoning skills. What she discovered apparently surprised even her, as she often paused during these sessions to make excited notes on her recording devices. The tests revealed that Kethvar's intelligence had been artificially suppressed by the neural control systems implanted in his brain. The Zephyrian handlers had deliberately limited his cognitive development to prevent independent thinking that might interfere with military objectives. Now, with those systems damaged by his injuries and gradually being repaired by human medical nanobots, his natural intelligence was emerging like a flower finally exposed to sunlight. The implications were staggering. Kethvar began to realize that the genetic modifications performed on his species had not just enhanced their physical capabilities but had included sophisticated psychological controls designed to ensure absolute obedience. The loyalty he had always considered instinctive was actually the result of carefully engineered neural pathways that suppressed free will and independent judgment. This revelation should have filled him with rage against his former masters, but, instead, it created a profound sense of loss for all the Vortak still serving the Empire. How many of his kind lived and died without ever experiencing true consciousness? How many brilliant minds were trapped behind walls of genetic programming, never knowing the full extent of their own potential? Dr. Chen seemed to understand his emotional turmoil without needing detailed explanations. She spent long hours simply sitting with him, her presence somehow comforting even when they couldn't communicate complex ideas. Her empathy was unlike anything in Kethvar's experience, a genuine concern for his well-being that asked for nothing in return and seemed to have no strategic purpose. On the fourth day, she introduced him to the other humans aboard the ship. There was Captain James Rodriguez, whose calm authority reminded Kethvar of the best military commanders but without their cold detachment. Engineer Susan Walsh displayed a technical brilliance that rivaled Zephyrian weapons designers, but she used her skills to create rather than destroy. Most intriguingly, there was psychologist Michael Torres, who specialized in helping traumatized beings recover from psychological damage. Dr. Torres's work with Kethvar proved to be both challenging and revelatory. Using techniques developed for treating human veterans of interstellar conflicts, he helped the Vortak identify and process emotions that had been suppressed for his entire life. The experience was initially terrifying, as Kethvar discovered feelings and impulses that his military conditioning had taught him to view as weakness. Fear, it turned out, was not simply a combat enhancement to be channeled into aggression. It could also be a protective instinct that motivated beings to seek safety and form social bonds. Sadness was not just a distraction from duty but a natural response to loss that helped process grief and move toward healing. Most surprisingly, joy was not merely the satisfaction of completing missions but could be found in simple experiences like learning something new or connecting with another conscious being. The psychological work was exhausting, requiring Kethvar to confront fundamental assumptions about his own nature and purpose. There were moments when he wanted to retreat into the familiar structure of military conditioning, where every decision was made by someone else and every action had clear strategic justification. The responsibility of independent thought was overwhelming after a lifetime of external control. But Dr. Torres was patient and skilled, never pushing too hard or moving too quickly. He helped Kethvar develop coping mechanisms for processing complex emotions and taught him techniques for maintaining psychological stability in the face of uncertainty. Most importantly, he helped the Vorthak understand that growth and change were natural processes, not failures of programming. The ship itself became a fascinating subject of study for Kethvar's expanding consciousness. Unlike Zephyrian vessels, which were designed as efficient weapons platforms with minimal accommodation for crew comfort, this human ship seemed optimized for long-term habitability. The corridors were wide enough for beings of various sizes to pass comfortably, and the walls were covered with displays showing images from what were apparently different human worlds. These images revealed a species of remarkable diversity, both biological and cultural. Humans came in a wide range of physical variations, with different skin colors, facial features, and body types all represented within the same species. Their worlds showed equal diversity, from ice-covered planets with crystalline cities to tropical paradises with floating settlements to desert worlds where humans lived in harmony with indigenous life forms. The concept of biological diversity within a single species was almost incomprehensible to Kethvar. Zephyrian society was built around genetic purity, with strict breeding programs designed to maintain optimal characteristics for specific social roles. The Vorthak themselves had been bred from dozens of different species over thousands of years, but always with the goal of creating uniform, predictable results. Human society, as Dr. Chen explained it through their growing shared vocabulary, seemed to celebrate differences rather than eliminate them. Humans actively sought out new perspectives and approaches, believing that diversity made their species stronger rather than weaker. This philosophy extended to their interactions with other species, as evidenced by their willingness to rescue and help a creature they had never encountered before. On the fifth day, Captain Rodriguez invited Kethvar to visit the ship's bridge, a gesture of trust that would have been unthinkable in Zephyrian military culture. War beasts were never allowed in command areas, as they were considered security risks and potential sources of contamination. The fact that these humans were willing to share their most sensitive spaces with him suggested either remarkable naivety or extraordinary confidence in their ability to judge character. The bridge was a masterpiece of ergonomic design, with workstations that could be quickly reconfigured to accommodate different species and body types. The main display showed their destination, a star system that Kethvar's navigation knowledge identified as being far beyond the borders of known galactic civilization. The humans were taking him to a place that existed completely outside the sphere of established interstellar politics. Captain Rodriguez explained, through a combination of words and holographic diagrams, that they were heading to a human research station called Haven. The facility was dedicated to studying displaced beings from across the galaxy, providing medical care and rehabilitation for creatures who had been traumatized by war or exploitation. Kethvar would be their first Vorthak patient, but they had successfully treated members of over 200 different species. The existence of such a facility challenged every assumption Kethvar had developed about galactic civilization. In his understanding, advanced species competed for resources and territory, viewing other forms of life primarily as potential threats or useful tools. The idea that an entire research station could be devoted to helping beings from other species, with no apparent strategic benefit, seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet as they approached the Haven system, the evidence of human benevolence became increasingly undeniable. The outer planets hosted refugee settlements for dozens of different species, each community designed to accommodate specific biological and cultural needs. Orbital stations provided medical facilities, educational centers, and research laboratories, all dedicated to improving life for beings who had no connection to humanity beyond their need for help. The main habitat, built around a stable asteroid in the system's habitable zone, was a marvel of engineering that rivaled anything in the Zephyrian Empire. But, where Zephyrian structures emphasized intimidation and military power, Haven radiated warmth and welcome. Its organic curves and natural lighting created an environment that somehow managed to feel both high-tech and alive, a perfect synthesis of advanced technology and biological comfort. As their ship approached the docking bay, Kethvar could see other vessels of dozens of different designs, representing species from across the galaxy. Some he recognized from military briefings about potential threats or conquered populations. Others were completely unknown, suggesting that human influence extended into regions of space that remained unmapped by major galactic powers. The docking bay itself was designed to accommodate ships and beings of wildly different configurations. Atmospheric processors maintained separate environmental zones for different species, while specialized handling equipment could safely transfer everything from crystalline energy beings to methane-breathing giants. The level of preparation and infrastructure required for such operations suggested that Haven had been in operation for decades or even centuries. Dr. Chin spent their final approach briefing Kethvar on what to expect at Haven. There would be more medical examinations to fully assess his condition and develop long-term treatment plans. He would meet with specialists in Vortak physiology and psychology, experts who had apparently spent years studying his species despite never having direct access to living subjects. Most importantly, he would have choices about his future that no military asset had ever been offered. The concept of choosing his own path remained difficult for Kethvar to fully grasp. His entire existence had been structured around serving purposes determined by others, following orders without question, and measuring success by his ability to complete assigned missions. The idea that he could decide for himself what kind of life to live, what goals to pursue, and what relationships to form was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. As they landed and the ship's cargo bay opened to reveal the interior of Haven, Kethvar took his first steps toward a future that was entirely his own. The gravity felt slightly lighter than standard, probably adjusted to accommodate the needs of various species rather than optimized for any single group. The air carried scents that spoke of growing things and living communities, a stark contrast to the recycled atmosphere of military vessels. Dr. Chen walked beside him as they entered the station proper, her presence providing emotional support as he confronted an environment unlike anything in his experience. The corridors were filled with beings from dozens of different species, all apparently living and working together in harmony. Some were refugees like himself, still showing signs of trauma and displacement. Others were clearly staff members, wearing the same style of clothing as the human crew but representing a diversity of species that seemed impossible. The most shocking sight was a group of young beings from various species playing together in an open area that served as some kind of recreational space. Among them was a juvenile Vortak, smaller than Kethvar but clearly of his own kind, engaged in what appeared to be a game with children from 5 or 6 other species. The young Vortak showed none of the rigid conditioning that Kethvar associated with his people, instead displaying the natural curiosity and playfulness that had been bred out of military lines. Dr. Chen noticed his reaction and guided him toward the play area. The juvenile Vortak looked up at their approach, his 4 eyes widening with recognition and excitement. He bounded over to them with the enthusiasm of youth, chattering in rapid subsonic harmonics that carried overtones Kethvar had never heard from one of his own kind. The young one's name was Tekla, and his story, as translated by Dr. Chen, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He had been found as an infant aboard a derelict Zephyrian transport, the sole survivor of what appeared to have been a pirate attack. Rather than being raised as a weapon, he had grown up at Haven surrounded by beings from many species, developing a unique perspective that combined Vortak genetics with multicultural socialization. Tekla's existence proved that Kethvar's people were capable of far more than military service. Without genetic conditioning and neural control systems, young Vortak could develop into brilliant, creative, emotionally healthy beings who formed bonds across species lines and contributed to communities in ways that had nothing to do with warfare. Seeing this potential made Kethvar's own liberation feel not just personal but representative of what could be possible for his entire species. As they continued through Haven, Dr. Chin introduced him to other staff members who would be working on his case. There was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a human xenobiologist who had spent 15 years studying Zephyrian biotechnology and its effects on modified species. Dr. Zethkar, a reformed Zephyrian scientist who had defected to human space and now worked to undo the damage caused by his former government's biological weapons programs. Most surprisingly, there was Commander Velnara, a former Zephyrian officer who had brought her own Vortak companion to Haven and was now dedicated to helping others make the transition to free life. Commander Velnara's story would prove to be crucial to Kethvar's understanding of his new situation. She had served in the Zephyrian military for over 30 years, rising to high rank through skill and dedication to the Empire's goals. But exposure to human philosophy during a diplomatic mission had gradually changed her perspective on the treatment of modified species and the ethics of genetic slavery. Her decision to defect had not been easy, as it meant abandoning everything she had worked to achieve and facing the possibility of being hunted as a traitor. But she had been unable to continue serving a system that treated intelligent beings as property, and her Vortak companion's obvious suffering under neural control had finally made inaction impossible. The reunion between Velnara and her companion, a massive Vortak named Groktar, demonstrated the kind of relationship that was possible between their species when based on mutual respect rather than domination. Groktar showed none of the submissive postures that characterized military-trained warbeasts. Instead, he interacted with his former handler as an equal, their communication based on genuine friendship and shared experiences. Watching this interaction, Kethvar began to understand that his rescue was not an isolated incident but part of a larger movement that sought to fundamentally change the relationship between different species in the galaxy. Humans had apparently been working for decades to undermine systems of exploitation and oppression, offering alternatives based on cooperation and mutual benefit. The scope of this effort became clear as Dr. Chen showed him to his quarters, a spacious apartment designed specifically to accommodate Vortak physiology while providing the kind of comfort and privacy that had never been available in military barracks. The walls were covered with information displays showing the locations of other Haven facilities throughout human space, each one dedicated to helping different types of displaced beings. There were rehabilitation centers for former slave species, educational facilities for beings whose intellectual development had been stunted by oppressive societies, medical stations for treating the effects of biological modification, and research installations working to develop better methods for helping traumatized individuals recover their sense of identity and purpose. The humans were building a parallel civilization based on completely different principles than those that governed the established galactic powers. Where the major empires competed for dominance through military might and economic exploitation, humanity seemed to be pursuing influence through compassion and assistance. They were creating networks of gratitude and cooperation that might prove more durable than any conquest-based empire. As Kethvar settled into his new quarters, surrounded by comforts he had never imagined and facing possibilities he was only beginning to understand, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Less than a week ago, he had been a weapon in service to an empire that viewed him as disposable property. Now he was a guest in a community that treated him as a person worthy of respect and care. The transformation was so profound that he sometimes wondered if it might all be an elaborate dream or hallucination. But the pain of his still healing injuries and the solid reality of his surroundings confirmed that this new life was genuine. The humans had not only saved his body but had offered him something far more valuable, the chance to discover who he might become when given the freedom to choose his own path. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he began the formal process of rehabilitation and integration into Haven society. There would be difficult decisions to make about his future and complex emotions to process as he continued to break free from lifelong conditioning. But, for the first time in his existence, Kethvar felt truly hopeful about what lay ahead. 3 months into his stay at Haven, Kethvar had undergone transformations that went far beyond physical healing. The sophisticated medical bay where Dr. Chen and her team had carefully removed the neural control implants from his brain was now just a memory, but the psychological work of rebuilding his identity continued daily in ways both challenging and rewarding. The removal surgery itself had been a marvel of human medical technology, performed by a joint team of human doctors and reformed Zephyrian scientists who understood the intricate bioengineering that had shaped his neural pathways. Dr. Zethkar, the defected Zephyrian researcher, had proved invaluable in mapping the control systems that had been literally grown into Kethvar's brain tissue during his early development. What they discovered during the surgery was both horrifying and fascinating. The Zephyrian military had not simply implanted control devices, but had actually modified the basic structure of Vortak neurons to make independence virtually impossible. Neural pathways associated with creative thinking, personal initiative, and emotional expression had been deliberately stunted, while circuits related to obedience, aggression, and tactical analysis had been enhanced far beyond normal levels. The process of undoing this damage required months of careful intervention, using a combination of surgical nanobots, genetic therapy, and neural stimulation to encourage the growth of suppressed brain regions. Dr. Chen monitored his progress daily, tracking the emergence of new neural connections as his consciousness gradually expanded to fill the intellectual potential that had always been present but locked away. The psychological effects of these changes were profound and sometimes overwhelming. Kethvar found himself experiencing emotions with an intensity that his previous conditioning had never allowed. Simple pleasures like the taste of food prepared by Haven's multi-species culinary staff could move him to something approaching ecstasy. The beauty of the station's hydroponics gardens, where plants from dozens of worlds created impossible combinations of colors and scents, sometimes brought him to tears he couldn't explain. But, perhaps the most significant change was his relationship with his own memories. As the neural blocks weakened and new connections formed, Kethvar began to remember aspects of his early life that had been completely suppressed. He recalled being captured as a very young juvenile on a world whose name he had never been told, separated from parents whose faces he was only now beginning to remember. These recovered memories were painful but also liberating. They proved that he had once been a normal Vorthak child, curious about the world and capable of forming loving bonds with his family. The violent, single-minded war beast he had become was not his true nature but the result of deliberate modification designed to serve the Empire's military needs. Dr. Torres, the human psychologist, helped him process these revelations through a combination of traditional therapy and advanced neurological techniques. Together, they mapped the boundaries between his authentic self and the imposed military persona, identifying which behaviors and thought patterns represented genuine aspects of his personality and which were artifacts of his conditioning. The work was exhausting and sometimes frightening. There were days when Kethvar felt like he was losing his identity entirely, as if the removal of military structure had left him with no sense of who he was supposed to be. The rigid certainties of his previous life had been replaced by a vast landscape of possibilities that seemed impossible to navigate. During these difficult periods, the support of Haven's community proved invaluable. Commander Velnara, who had been through a similar process of identity reconstruction after her defection, became a mentor and guide. Her Vorthak companion Groktar served as a living example of what was possible when the bonds of genetic programming were broken. Groktar's transformation had taken place over several years, and he still bore scars both physical and psychological from his time in military service. But he had developed into a thoughtful, creative individual whose insights often surprised even the human staff. He worked in Haven's engineering section, where his enhanced spatial reasoning and problem-solving abilities made him invaluable for designing equipment that could accommodate the needs of multiple species. The friendship that developed between Kethvar and Groktar became one of the most important relationships in either of their lives. For the first time, Kethvar was able to communicate with another member of his species without the filter of military hierarchy or handler oversight. Their conversations, conducted in the complex harmonic language of the Vorthak, allowed them to share experiences and emotions that no other species could fully understand. Through Groktar, Kethvar learned about the growing network of liberated Vorthak who had found their way to human space. There were now over 60 of his kind living throughout Haven's various facilities, each one working through their own process of recovery and self-discovery. Some had been rescued from battlefields like himself, while others had escaped from research facilities or managed to break free from their conditioning through various circumstances. The diversity of experiences among the liberated Vorthak was remarkable. Some, like young Tekla who had never been conditioned, developed personalities that seemed almost alien to those raised in military service. Others retained many aspects of their warrior training but channeled those abilities into protective and constructive purposes. A few had chosen to dedicate themselves to research and education, using their intimate knowledge of Zephyrian military systems to help develop countermeasures and rescue strategies. This diversity challenged Kethvar's assumptions about the fundamental nature of his species. He had been taught that Vorthak were naturally aggressive, hierarchical, and suited only for military service. But the evidence before him suggested that his people were actually highly adaptable, capable of thriving in a wide range of environments and social structures when given the opportunity to develop naturally. The revelation led to a period of intense philosophical questioning about identity, free will, and the nature of consciousness itself. If his personality and preferences had been artificially shaped by genetic modification and neural conditioning, what aspects of himself could be considered authentic? Was the growing sense of curiosity and compassion he felt a return to his true nature, or simply another form of environmental conditioning imposed by human society? Dr. Torres helped him work through these questions without providing easy answers. The psychologist's approach emphasized that identity was always fluid and multifaceted, shaped by both genetics and experience in ways that made simple categorization impossible. What mattered was not determining which aspects of himself were real but, rather taking ownership of his choices and growth moving forward. This philosophical framework proved liberating in ways that Cathvar had not expected. Instead of being paralyzed by uncertainty about his authentic nature, he began to view his emerging personality as a work in progress that he had the power to shape. The realization that he could choose what kind of being to become was both terrifying and exhilarating. His exploration of this new freedom took many forms. He began spending hours in Haven's extensive library, absorbing information about topics that had nothing to do with military applications. History, art, philosophy, and science became sources of fascination rather than mere tools for combat effectiveness. The discovery that knowledge could be pursued for its own sake, without immediate practical application, opened up intellectual horizons he had never imagined. The library also introduced him to literature from hundreds of different species, including extensive collections of human writing that revealed the depth and complexity of their civilization. He read accounts of human history that included both magnificent achievements and terrible mistakes, learning about a species that had struggled with many of the same issues of identity, freedom, and social justice that he was now confronting personally. One book that particularly moved him was a human memoir written by a former child soldier who had been rescued and rehabilitated after years of forced military service. The parallels to his own experience were striking, even across species lines. The human author described the same sense of lost identity, the same difficulty in distinguishing between authentic emotions and programmed responses, and the same gradual process of reclaiming selfhood through patience, support, and determination. Reading about human approaches to recovery and healing provided Cathvar with a broader context for understanding his own journey. Humans had apparently developed sophisticated methods for helping traumatized individuals precisely because their own history included so many examples of exploitation and abuse. Their expertise in rehabilitation came not from natural superiority but from hard-won experience in overcoming their own societal failures. This knowledge helped Cathvar develop a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between humans and other species. He began to see their rescue efforts not as condescending charity but as an expression of values developed through their own struggles with injustice and oppression. They helped others because they understood from personal experience how much difference such help could make. As his understanding deepened, Cathvar found himself increasingly drawn to the possibility of contributing to Haven's mission himself. The idea of helping other liberated beings navigate the challenges of freedom appealed to both his protective instincts and his growing sense of social responsibility. But the transition from rescued victim to active participant would require him to confront aspects of his past that he had been avoiding. The turning point came when a new group of rescued Vordhak arrived at Haven, victims of a successful raid on a Zephyrian research facility where they had been subjected to experimental modifications. The newcomers were in even worse condition than Cathvar had been, their personalities so damaged by torture and conditioning that they could barely function as individuals. Dr. Chen asked Cathvar if he would be willing to help with their rehabilitation, believing that communication with a member of their own species might be more effective than human intervention alone. The request forced him to decide whether he was ready to use his own traumatic experiences as a tool for helping others, a prospect that was both appealing and terrifying. His first meeting with the new arrivals was one of the most difficult experiences of his life. The rescued Vordhak showed none of the gradual awakening that had characterized his own recovery. Instead, they displayed the flat effect and mechanical responses of beings whose personalities had been almost completely erased. They responded to questions with military protocols, showed no curiosity about their new environment, and seemed incapable of forming emotional connections. Seeing them was like looking into a mirror that reflected his own past, forcing Cathvar to confront the full extent of what had been done to him and his people. The rage that welled up inside him was so intense that he had to leave the room before he said or did something that might further traumatize the already damaged beings. But anger, he realized, was not enough. These broken individuals needed patience, understanding, and the kind of gradual rehabilitation that had saved his own sanity. If he truly wanted to honor his own liberation, he would need to find the strength to help others achieve the same freedom. Working with the new arrivals became Cathvar's primary focus over the following months. Under Dr. Chen's supervision, he developed techniques for establishing basic communication with severely conditioned Vordhak, using harmonic frequencies and behavioral cues that bypassed conscious resistance. The work was slow and, often frustrating, requiring him to repeatedly demonstrate concepts like safety, choice, and individual worth to beings who had been programmed to see such ideas as dangerous weaknesses. But, gradually, progress began to emerge. One of the rescued Vorthak, a female named Silthera who had been modified for reconnaissance operations, began showing signs of curiosity about her surroundings. Another, a massive male called Kromdag who had been trained as a siegebreaker, started expressing preferences about food and environment that went beyond basic survival needs. Each small victory felt like a personal triumph to Kethvar, proof that no amount of conditioning could completely destroy the essential spark of individual consciousness. The work was teaching him as much about his own recovery as it was helping the newcomers, showing him how far he had come and giving him a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own healing. The process also deepened his appreciation for the humans who had saved him. Watching Dr. Chen worked tirelessly with beings who showed little immediate response to her efforts. He began to understand the extraordinary patience and dedication required to help severely traumatized individuals. The humans invested enormous resources in rehabilitation efforts that might take years to show results, driven by philosophical commitments that valued every conscious being regardless of their apparent utility. This commitment to universal dignity was unlike anything in Kethvar's understanding of galactic civilization. Even the most benevolent species typically limited their altruism to members of their own group or close allies. The human willingness to expend significant effort helping complete strangers from distant species suggested either remarkable naivety or a level of moral development that other civilizations had not achieved. As his own skills as a counselor and rehabilitator developed, Kethvar began to suspect that human moral development was not accidental but the result of specific historical experiences and cultural choices. Their literature and history revealed a species that had made tremendous mistakes, including slavery, genocide, and environmental destruction on a planetary scale. But they had also demonstrated an unusual capacity for learning from these mistakes and developing institutional structures designed to prevent their repetition. This pattern of failure, recognition, and improvement seemed to be central to human moral evolution. Unlike species that viewed themselves as naturally superior or inherently righteous, humans appeared to assume that they were capable of terrible errors and needed constant vigilance to maintain ethical behavior. This humility made them more effective at recognizing and correcting injustices, both within their own society and in their interactions with other species. Understanding this aspect of human psychology helped Kethvar appreciate why they had been able to develop such effective rehabilitation techniques. They approached each rescued being with the assumption that recovery was possible, but they also recognized that the process would be difficult and require ongoing support. Their methods were based on realistic assessments of both the challenges involved and the potential for positive change. By the end of his first year at Haven, Kethvar had not only completed his own rehabilitation but had become an integral part of the facility's mission to help other liberated beings. His work with traumatized Vorthak had expanded to include members of other modified species, as his insights into the psychology of genetic programming proved applicable across species lines. The transformation from abandoned war beast to respected counselor and educator was so complete that sometimes Kethvar had difficulty believing it was real. But the evidence was undeniable, reflected in the faces of the beings he had helped and the respect with which his human colleagues treated him. Most importantly, he had discovered something that his military conditioning had taught him was impossible, a sense of purpose that came not from serving others' goals but from choosing to dedicate his abilities to causes he personally believed in. The freedom to make meaningful choices about his own life had revealed capacities and interests that no amount of genetic programming could have predicted or controlled. 2 years after his rescue from Zirian Prime, Kethvar stood before a gathering that would have been unimaginable during his military service, a council of liberated beings representing over 30 different species, all former victims of genetic modification, slavery, or other forms of exploitation. The meeting was taking place aboard Haven Station's main conference facility, a vast amphitheater designed to accommodate the diverse physiological needs of its participants. The agenda for this historic gathering was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted in galactic politics. Representatives from across human space had come together to discuss the formation of what they were calling the Liberation Alliance, a multi-species organization dedicated to systematically undermining systems of oppression throughout the galaxy. What made the proposal revolutionary was not just its scope, but the fact that it was being led by former victims rather than established powers. Kethvar's role in these proceedings reflected his transformation from rescued refugee to respected leader within the growing liberation movement. Over the past year, he had become one of Haven's most effective rehabilitation specialists, helping dozens of traumatized beings reclaim their identities and find new purposes in life. His success had led to invitations to speak at other facilities, and gradually his influence had spread throughout the network of safe havens that humans had established across their territory. The speech he was about to deliver would outline a proposal that had been developing in his mind for months, sparked by disturbing intelligence reports about the ongoing treatment of Vorthak and other modified species within the Zephyrian Empire. Recent refugees had brought stories of new experimental programs designed to create even more effective biological weapons, including attempts to breed Vorthak with enhanced psionic abilities for use in psychological warfare operations. These reports had convinced Kethvar that passive rescue efforts, while important, were insufficient to address the magnitude of the problem. Millions of intelligent beings remained trapped in systems that denied their basic right to self-determination, and their numbers were growing as various empires expanded their modification programs. What was needed was not just individual liberation but systematic intervention to disrupt the infrastructure of oppression itself. As he approached the speaker's platform, Kethvar reflected on how much his understanding of galactic politics had evolved since his rescue. His military training had provided him with extensive knowledge of various empires' capabilities and strategies, but it had never encouraged him to question the fundamental assumptions underlying those systems. Now, freed from the constraints of programmed loyalty, he could see patterns and possibilities that had been invisible to him as a weapon in service to the Empire. The humans had played a crucial role in developing his political awareness, but they had been careful not to impose their own ideologies on his thinking. Instead, they had provided him with access to information and analytical tools, allowing him to draw his own conclusions about the nature of galactic civilization and the changes that needed to be made. This approach had proven far more effective than indoctrination would have been, as it had led to insights that were genuinely his own rather than merely adopted from his rescuers. Standing before the assembled representatives, Kethvar began his presentation with a moment of silent appreciation for the diversity of the audience. There were former Carthari mining slaves whose crystalline bodies still bore scars from industrial accidents. Escaped Velcrin pleasure servitors whose empathic abilities had been artificially enhanced for the entertainment of their owners. Reformed Nexari shock troops whose aggression conditioning had been similar to his own but even more extensive. Each species represented a different approach to exploitation, but all shared the experience of having their natural development perverted to serve others' purposes. Fellow beings of liberation, Kethvar began, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made Vorthak's speech so distinctive. We gather today not just as survivors, but as architects of a future where the horrors we have experienced become impossible for others to endure. Our individual transformations have proven that no amount of conditioning or modification can permanently destroy the spark of consciousness that defines us as thinking beings. Now we must ask ourselves, what do we owe to those who still suffer under the systems we have escaped? The question resonated through the amphitheater, creating a moment of contemplative silence as each representative considered their own journey from victim to advocate. Kethvar had learned from his human mentors that effective political rhetoric required more than just emotional appeals, it needed to connect personal experiences to broader principles and practical possibilities. For too long, he continued, the major powers of this galaxy have treated consciousness as a commodity to be harvested, modified, and exploited. They justify this practice by claiming that different species have different natural roles, that some are inherently suited for servitude while others are destined for leadership. But every being in this chamber stands as living proof that such claims are lies designed to perpetuate systems of oppression. The response from the audience was immediate and powerful, as representatives from various species voiced their agreement in forms ranging from harmonic choruses to bioluminescent displays. This diversity of expression itself demonstrated the point Kethvar was making about the fundamental equality of consciousness across species lines. He went on to outline the intelligence he had gathered about current exploitation practices throughout the galaxy, drawing on both his military knowledge and reports from recently liberated beings. The picture that emerged was deeply disturbing, revealing that the Zephyrian Empire's use of modified war beasts was only one example of a much broader pattern of biological slavery that affected millions of intelligent beings. The Kind Confederacy had developed techniques for turning captured enemy soldiers into loyal servitors through neural restructuring that preserved their tactical knowledge while eliminating their capacity for independent action. The Void Shepherds were experimenting with consciousness transfer, attempting to create immortal leaders by moving elite minds into specially modified bodies of conquered species. Most horrifically, the Eternal Court had begun treating entire planetary populations as raw material for genetic experimentation, turning billions of beings into living laboratories for developing new forms of biological weaponry. These practices are not aberrations, Kethvar explained, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. They are the logical result of political systems that recognize no limits on the exploitation of those deemed inferior. Every species that achieves technological dominance faces the temptation to use their power to reshape others according to their own needs and desires. The only way to break this cycle is to create alternative power structures based on fundamentally different principles. This observation led to the core of his proposal, the formation of a military and intelligence organization dedicated to liberating oppressed beings throughout the galaxy. The Liberation Alliance would combine the resources and expertise of human rehabilitation specialists with the inside knowledge and specialized capabilities of liberated beings like themselves. Their goal would not be conquest or revenge, but the systematic dismantling of oppression infrastructure and the creation of safe havens for those seeking freedom. The proposal was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. The combined military might of the established empires vastly exceeded anything that humans and their allies could field in direct confrontation. But Kethvar argued that conventional military thinking was inadequate for addressing the challenge they faced. What was needed was not superior firepower but superior strategy, leveraging the unique advantages that came from being underestimated and misunderstood by their opponents. The empires that oppress us share a fundamental weakness, he explained. They cannot imagine that their victims might be capable of organized resistance. They see us as broken tools, damaged property that poses no threat to their power structures. This blindness creates opportunities that we must learn to exploit. He went on to detail specific strategies that could be employed by a liberation force operating according to different principles than conventional military organizations. Instead of trying to hold territory, they would focus on disrupting the infrastructure of oppression itself. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation with superior forces, they would use stealth, intelligence, and the element of surprise to achieve maximum impact with minimal resources. The key to success, Kethvar argued, lay in understanding that their greatest weapon was not technology but the simple fact that liberated beings fought with a determination that no amount of conditioning could duplicate. Slaves and servants might follow orders efficiently, but only free beings would risk everything for the chance to help others achieve the same liberation they had experienced. This principle had already been demonstrated on a small scale through the rescue operations that had brought many of them to human space. Teams consisting of liberated beings and human volunteers had successfully infiltrated facilities throughout the galaxy, extracting victims of oppression and gathering intelligence about their captors' operations. These missions had been remarkably successful precisely because no one expected former slaves to return to the sites of their imprisonment as liberators. The discussion that followed Kethvar's presentation was intense and far-ranging, covering everything from operational logistics to philosophical questions about the use of force in pursuit of liberation. Some representatives argued that violent resistance would only provoke harsher crackdowns against those still trapped in oppressive systems. Others contended that peaceful methods had proven inadequate to address the scale of suffering involved. Dr. Chen, representing the human contingent, provided crucial perspective on these debates by sharing her species' own historical experience with liberation movements. Humans had tried both violent and non-violent approaches to ending oppression, with varying degrees of success depending on specific circumstances and the nature of the systems they were fighting against. The key lesson from their history was that effective liberation required a combination of strategies, adapted to the particular vulnerabilities of each oppressive regime. Commander Valnara, the former Zephyrian officer who had become one of the most effective advocates for Vorthak liberation, offered insights into the military aspects of the proposed organization. Her knowledge of imperial defense strategies would be invaluable for planning operations that could succeed against superior conventional forces. But she also emphasized the importance of maintaining ethical standards that distinguished liberation forces from the enemies they fought against. "We cannot become the very evil we seek to destroy," she warned. If we use the same methods of deception, exploitation, and violence that characterize our oppressors, we will merely create new forms of tyranny to replace the old ones. Our strength must come not from superior ruthlessness but from superior principles. This ethical dimension of the liberation struggle proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the discussion. Many of the assembled representatives had suffered terrible abuses at the hands of their former captors, creating natural desires for revenge that complicated their commitment to justice. The human example was again instructive, as their history included numerous instances where justified anger had led to cycles of retaliation that ultimately harmed innocent beings. Dr. Torres, the psychologist who had been instrumental in Kethvar's own rehabilitation, contributed important insights about the psychological challenges that liberation fighters would face. The transition from victim to active agent of change was psychologically complex, requiring ongoing support to prevent former victims from being consumed by anger or damaged by exposure to the very systems they were trying to destroy. Young Tekla, now grown into a thoughtful advocate for his people despite his youth, raised questions about the long-term goals of the liberation movement. What kind of galactic civilization did they hope to create after dismantling the current systems of oppression? How would they prevent their own organization from evolving into just another power structure that might eventually exploit those it claimed to protect? These questions led to extended discussions about governance, accountability, and the principles that should guide any new political arrangements they might help to establish. The diversity of species and experiences represented in the chamber made consensus difficult, but it also ensured that multiple perspectives were considered in developing answers to these fundamental challenges. The debates continued for 3 days, with working groups forming to address specific aspects of the proposed Liberation Alliance. Military strategy, intelligence gathering, rehabilitation protocols, political philosophy, and resource allocation all required detailed planning if the organization was to have any chance of success. Gradually, a framework began to emerge that reflected the unique character of the alliance they were trying to create. Unlike traditional military organizations, the Liberation Alliance would be structured as a confederation of autonomous units, each adapted to the specific needs and capabilities of different species and regions. This approach would make the organization more resilient against attempts to destroy it while also ensuring that no single group could dominate decision-making processes. The operational doctrine that emerged emphasized precision over force, liberation over conquest, and preservation of life over military advantage. Every mission would be planned with the goal of minimizing casualties while maximizing the number of oppressed beings who could be reached and assisted. Success would be measured not by territory controlled or enemies destroyed, but by the number of conscious beings who achieved freedom and the degree to which oppressive systems were disrupted. Financing for the organization would come from a combination of sources, including voluntary contributions from liberated beings who had achieved economic success, profits from legitimate business ventures operated by alliance members, and captured resources from oppressive regimes that could be redirected toward humanitarian purposes. The humans pledged significant support in terms of technology, training, and logistical infrastructure, but they insisted that leadership of the alliance must come from the liberated beings themselves. By the end of the conference, the framework for the Liberation Alliance had been established, with Kethvar unanimously selected as its first supreme coordinator. The title reflected his role as a leader and organizer rather than a military commander, emphasizing the alliance's commitment to collaborative rather than authoritarian leadership structures. The selection of Kethvar for this role was particularly significant because it represented the ultimate transformation of a being who had been created to serve others' purposes into someone capable of inspiring others to fight for their own freedom. His journey from abandoned war beast to liberation leader demonstrated the potential that existed within every oppressed being, given the opportunity and support necessary for development. As the conference concluded and representatives prepared to return to their respective regions to begin organizing local cells of the Liberation Alliance, Kethvar found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had undertaken. The task ahead was daunting, requiring them to challenge systems that had dominated galactic civilization for millennia. But he was no longer the broken creature who had been abandoned on Zirian Prime 3 years earlier. The support of the human community had allowed him to discover capabilities and strengths he had never known he possessed. The friendship of other liberated beings had taught him that cooperation and mutual aid could accomplish things that individual action could never achieve. Most importantly, the work he had done helping other traumatized beings recover their sense of self had shown him that liberation was not just possible but inevitable for any conscious being given the right circumstances and support. The Liberation Alliance would provide those circumstances on a galactic scale, offering hope to millions of beings who had never imagined that freedom might be possible. Standing in the empty amphitheater after the last delegates had departed, Kethvar made a solemn promise to the memory of his fallen handler and all the other beings who had died without ever knowing freedom. Their sacrifices would not be forgotten, and their suffering would not be allowed to continue for others. The liberation of the galaxy had begun, and there would be no turning back. 5 years after the founding of the Liberation Alliance, the galaxy trembled with changes that no military strategist or political analyst had predicted. What had begun as a small organization of rescued slaves and refugees had evolved into a revolutionary force that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying interstellar civilization. The transformation was so profound that historians would later mark this period as the beginning of the Second Galactic Age, when consciousness itself became recognized as the most precious resource in the universe. Kethvar stood on the observation deck of the Alliance flagship New Dawn, watching through reinforced viewports as the latest liberation mission unfolded in the space around them. Below, teams of Alliance operatives were systematically dismantling a Zephyrian research facility that had been conducting genetic modification experiments on captured civilians from a dozen different species. The operation represented everything the Alliance had learned about effective liberation tactics over the past half-decade of struggle. The facility's defenses, designed to repel conventional military attacks, had been bypassed entirely through a combination of inside intelligence and technological innovation. Former Zephyrian personnel who had defected to the Alliance had provided detailed information about security protocols, while human engineers had developed stealth systems that made Alliance ships virtually invisible to Imperial sensors. But the most crucial element of the operation was the team of liberated Vorthak who had volunteered to infiltrate the facility by posing as newly captured specimens. Their intimate knowledge of Imperial procedures and their ability to communicate with other war beasts had allowed them to coordinate a simultaneous uprising that overwhelmed the guards before any alarm could be raised. Watching as people fight not as weapons controlled by others but as free beings choosing to risk their lives for a cause they believed in, Kethvar felt a mixture of pride and sorrow that had become familiar over the years of struggle. Pride in seeing the magnificent potential that emerged when Vorthak were allowed to develop their full capabilities, and sorrow for all the members of his species who had lived and died without ever experiencing such freedom. The liberation of the research facility would free over 300 beings who had been subjected to various forms of genetic modification and neural conditioning. More importantly, it would destroy irreplaceable research data and equipment, setting back the Empire's biological weapons program by years. But the true significance of the operation lay in what it demonstrated about the changing balance of power in the galaxy. The Liberation Alliance had grown far beyond what anyone had imagined possible when it was first proposed. What had started as a confederation of rescue operations had evolved into a sophisticated organization with cells operating throughout civilized space. Their success had attracted support from unexpected quarters, including reform movements within several major empires and underground networks that had been working towards similar goals for generations. The Alliance's approach to expansion had been radically different from traditional imperial strategies. Instead of conquering territory and imposing their will on conquered populations, they focused on building networks of cooperation and mutual aid that strengthened with each new member. Every liberated being became a potential advocate and organizer, spreading the Alliance's message and methods to new communities and species. This organic growth model had proven remarkably resilient against attempts to destroy or co-opt the organization. Imperial intelligence services found it almost impossible to penetrate networks built on personal relationships and shared experiences of liberation. Traditional military tactics were ineffective against an enemy that controlled no fixed bases and whose greatest strength lay in the motivation of its members rather than their equipment. The psychological impact of the Alliance's success had begun to reverberate throughout galactic society in ways that surprised even Kethvar. Oppressive regimes that had once seemed unshakable were facing internal rebellions as their victim populations began to believe that freedom was actually possible. The mere existence of the Liberation Alliance served as proof that alternatives to exploitation existed, undermining the ideological foundations that supported systems of oppression. Intelligence reports reaching Alliance headquarters told of dramatic changes occurring throughout the galaxy. On worlds where genetic modification had been used to create compliant labor forces, workers were beginning to resist programming that had controlled them for generations. Military units composed of conditioned soldiers were experiencing unprecedented rates of defection as awareness of alliance activities spread. Even the ruling classes of several empires were beginning to question practices that they had previously accepted as natural and necessary. The human contribution to these developments had proven crucial in ways that went beyond providing safe havens and technical support. Human psychology included a remarkable capacity for recognizing and developing potential in other species, allowing them to see possibilities that victims of oppression often couldn't imagine for themselves. Their historical experience with various forms of liberation struggle provided valuable lessons about effective organizing strategies and the importance of maintaining ethical standards under extreme pressure. But, perhaps most importantly, humans had demonstrated that it was possible for a dominant species to voluntarily limit their own power in service of universal principles. Instead of using their technological advantages to create their own empire, they had chosen to support the self-liberation of others. This example had inspired similar choices among reform movements within established powers, creating cracks in the seemingly monolithic structure of galactic oppression. Dr. Chen, now serving as the Alliance's chief medical officer and Kethvar's closest human friend, joined him on the observation deck as the liberation operation reached its final phase. The research facility's self-destruct systems had been disabled, allowing Alliance teams to safely evacuate all personnel and valuable intelligence materials. The operation would be recorded as a complete success, with 0 casualties among Alliance forces and no permanent harm to any of the liberated beings. Another facility down, and another few hundred beings free, Dr. Chin observed, watching as transport ships carried the rescued victims toward Alliance medical facilities where they would begin their